Welcome everybody. My name is Nigel White. I'm a Centre Engineer and today we're going to learn about some of the new features in the EXTJS6 grid, and we're going to recap some features which may be little known but which may enhance the performance of the grids in your application and enhance your user's experience. Okay. We've got several new features in EXTJS6. The major one is Spreadsheet Selection. And this will give you new ways to slice, dice, and drill down into your data set. Starting in EXTJS5, we had full keyboard navigability of your grid. Cells took focus, and you could use arrow keys to navigate between the cells. Well, we've taken this a step further in EXTJS6, and you can navigate inside the cells into focusable content like widgets or action columns or checkboxes or links. Whatever is focusable inside a cell, you can now get to it using keyboard accessibility, and I'll demonstrate that later. And we can have full interactive widgets inside cells. This has been in for a while, but the last time we introduced it, it worked in a slightly different way. This is a much simpler way. You can configure a widget and it's rendered inside the cell. And if they get scrolled off the top in buffered rendering, they'll be reused and recycled when new rows are added to the grid. Okay, who here is fully familiar with the grid? I assume everybody here is intimately familiar with it. Okay, a few not. So I'm going to go over the basics of how you create a grid. So we have to begin with the data for it. How to load your data and how to incrementally load it. This is important if you have a very large data set, maybe millions of rows. You don't want to load it all into the client at once. We can load it page by page, and we can have the UI only demand pages that it needs to display. Okay, we're going to look at ways to maximize performance. So if you're having a rapidly updating grid, maybe financial information which updates in real time, we're going to look at ways of enhancing the performance so that we don't do more layouts than we need. That's more browser layouts and more EXTJS layouts. And we'll see how all the features can be used all at once, and they'll all work together in the grid at the same time. Okay, in terms of the data, the first thing that you'll need is to define a model. A model encapsulates your business entity. It extends the ext.data.model base class. It always has an ID, which is its unique row ID, and it contains fields. Instances of this we call records. Fields in the record. Hello? Yeah, we have all the standard types are included: string, date, integer, but you can define your own fields. And if you have to aggregate data and make complex types, then this is the way to do it. You define a calculate field, a calculate method on your field, which can pull in data from different input fields in the input data. Using a calculate function means that the value of the field is recalculated if any fields on which it depends change. So what we do here is we parse that function, and if foo or bar are changed, then instances of this field are recalculated. We'll see that demonstrated as well. Finally, all this is aggregated into a store. Record instances are read through a proxy, and they're collected in the store, and what is in the store is mapped into the grid. Okay, to load the data. So as I was talking about before, if you have a very large data set, millions of rows, you can specify that your store is type buffered, and this means that it only loads pages which the view needs to display. Another way of doing that is using paging. We've all seen a paged grid, but a buffered grid allows you to see a scroll range and to scroll without the interruption of having to change pages. Autoload true has always worked on the store definition, but if you're using stateful grids, it's best to put this on the grid. This is because if you put autoload on the store, it'll kick off a load very early, but then when the grid fires up its own state, it sets up filters or sorters. It will then have to load the store again. So if you put the autoload on the grid, then it will only load once. Okay, it's very easy to define a grid. A grid is just a panel. There are only two more configurations that it needs over and above standard panel configurations. You need to tell it the store, which the data is coming from, and you need to give it a set of columns which associate column header text with fields in your records. Okay, those are the basics. So now some new stuff. We've got a new class which helps you address individual cells in your grid. It's called a CellContext. It encapsulates a reference to a record and column intersection. So you can construct it using either a column and record, or you can construct it using a record index and a column index. If you construct it from a record index and a column index, it will convert that and actually maintain a reference to the record and the column which those referred to. So it's fairly durable. If you move columns, if you sort your data, it will still refer to the same cell, even though it may have moved. And CellContext has several utility methods. You can actually ask to retrieve the HTML cell element to which it refers, and you can also ask to retrieve the HTML row element which contains that cell. So you can manipulate those elements. Obviously, they can become stale. If you filter the store and the record goes out of the store, or if you remove the column, the CellContext will refer to a non-existent cell. So don't persist these things too long. Just be aware that they can end up referring to cells which no longer exist. But these are used in the new Spreadsheet SelectionModel to describe cells in it. Okay, and this is an example of how you'd use it. You can create a CellContext referencing a view, set it position by index, and then you can call methods on it. GetCell returns the cell, and then that's an element, and you can call any element method on there. So you could highlight it and draw attention to it. Okay, we're going to go to an example now which shows a few of these techniques. Okay, we'll see it using a formatter instead of a renderer. A formatter is the name of a method in the ext.util.format class, which provides automatic rendering in various data formats. So you can have a numeric formatter or a date formatter. You don't have to give it a function. We're using the Spreadsheet SelectionModel to divide the data up and cut it down into only the parts we want to see. And we'll see selection extension, which is where you can extend the spreadsheet, extend the existing selection to encompass more data. Okay, the Spreadsheet SelectionModel can have three different selection types. You can select multiple discontiguous rows, and there are new gestures which are available to do that. You can use mouse down and swipe to select multiple rows, as well as click or control click to add rows. And by default, row selection is enabled. If you want to disable that, you configure it like this: row select false. You can also select multiple columns. By default, column selection is off because it's a more unusual way of doing selection. If you want to select columns, you have to configure it column select true. And you can also select a contiguous block of cells. Currently, only one contiguous block of cells can be selected. This is selected by default. If you don't want to select cells, you configure it cell select false. And this is how the extender works. If you configure it extensible true, you get a handle at the bottom edge of your selection area, and you can drag it with the mouse, and it extends the selection into the area that you can see. And during this, you get an event. You get an event when each new row is selected or each new column is selected, and so you can add any activity. And you also get an event when you mouse up, so that whatever you need to do to populate that area, if you need to change it, you can do at that time. Okay, so when you've selected some data, programmatically, you might need to interrogate that data in some way. And so there are three types of selection you can have. You can have a cell selection object, a row selection object, or a column selection object, but they all have one standard interface, which you can use to interrogate them. So they all have an each cell method, which allows you to iterate through all the cells and call a function. They have an each row and an each column. The standard format, you pass it the function and the function scope, which you want it to execute in. They all have a getCount method, which returns a count of whichever entities they're holding, cells, rows, or columns, and there's a clear method, which clears down the selection. They have their own separate interfaces as well, but this is common to all three selection types. So if you get a row selection object, you can always call getRecords on it, and that will return all the records you've selected. If you have a cell selection object, it doesn't actually hold a reference to every cell you've selected. That would be a bit too wasteful. What you get is a range, which is an array consisting of two XY coordinates, start column, start row, end column, end row. And you can then use CellContext objects to reference those columns if you need to, reference those cells if you need to. Column selection object, you can ask it get columns, and it will return an array of the columns you've selected. So only one of these selection modes may be used at any one time. The selection model may be configured to allow all three. You can select rows, you can select columns, you can select cells, but you can only select one type at a time. So if you've selected a block of cells and then you select a row, the cell selection will disappear. But you can change all the three configs dynamically. You can turn off and turn on each type. Okay. Another thing we're going to see demonstrated is putting widgets inside of grid cells. So in theory, you can get as complex as you like by putting any kinds of widgets inside cells. And we're going to see an example of putting a chart inside a cell. And so this is how you do it. X-type widget column. Data index gives you the field which is going to be fed into the default bind property of the widget. So the default bind property of a chart is a store. So we're going to have a field in our record which is itself a store, and the chart will draw its data from that. Okay, we can go into a demo now. Okay, here we can see a couple of months of stock price history of our favorite tech company, Apple. And you can see what happens if we click on a column. That column is selected, and that column is dynamically added as a series to a chart. And if we do shift-click on this column, all those columns are selected, and all the data under those columns are added as a series to the chart. But we can do more with the spreadsheet selection model. We can dice your data in different ways. So what if you only wanted to see just a smaller range of dates? So what you do is you say, okay, I only want to go from the 13th to the 24th. Okay, and what we've done there is we're using a chained store. We have the master store, which drives the grid, And we've got a chain store which drives the chart. By default, they mirror each other. They're the same data, but if we filter the chain store, the master store isn't affected, but the chain store gets fewer records. So we've filtered this chain store down to only contain the date range we need. And as you can see, we can select that, and there's the event happening as you move. You can see it describing what you're doing. This is an event firing, and when you mouse up, you can see the event telling you you've extended your selection, and you saw more data get added. And one more thing, if you have selected columns, then however you then manipulate your data, you can add and remove data. All the records in the column are still going to be selected. So we can change our date range here and go all the way back to January, and the graph will change. It's just maintained, the whole column is still selected. Okay. Another point I covered was calculated fields. So if you've got a field which is dependent on the value of other fields, what you could use is a cell renderer. You could use a complex renderer which looks at the record, creates the value, and then renders it. But that's less efficient than using a calculated field. So to show why, the appellation field here is a concatenation of the names. But if we change the date of birth, you see that render count goes to 2. It's re-rendered that. That uses a custom renderer. It's re-rendered it because we don't know what fields that renderer looks at. All we know is it looks at the record and does something with it. So if any other field in the record changes, we have to call the renderer. With the calculated field, it only depends on the values of the fields it knows it depends on. So if you change the date of birth, yeah, this one went to 3, that one stays at 1. This will only re-render if you change that value. So this is why calculated fields are important. Okay, and we have a little demo of the cell context here. So if we use CellContext 00, highlight cell does that, highlight row does that. So you can easily access your cells and rows. Okay, how you select your data. You can do it programmatically or using user gestures. So to select rows, you can click and swipe down, and that will select rows, or you can call a selection model method directly, select rows, and pass a set of records. Keep existing, true or false means either discard the current selection or keep it. Select cells, you pass an XY range, beginning cell and an end cell, and it will select that block. That's in addition to the click swipe user gesture. And select columns, you just call select column and pass a column reference. It's also got the keep selection flag. Okay, so we can go to another example now. So what we're going to see here is keyboard navigability in both navigable mode and actionable mode. So actionable mode is where you can get inside the cell. That exposes any tabbable content you've got in the cells. This is also a buffered store. It may load a lot of data, but it only loads what the UI needs. And we can see applying filters to the store. And in EXTJS 5, you may not have noticed, but we introduced multi-column sort, so you can click on multiple columns and each one will add to the sort. It won't remove the previous sorted column. And you can see here it's themed using the new easy theming. Okay, so we can look for some property in a certain zip code. Okay, that's loaded 1 or 2 pages of data from a large data set. And if we scroll it down, you'll be able to see it then loads it on demand because the page that it needs to display this wasn't in the data set at the time. You can add filters to the store. And we have multiple filter types. This is part of the data package, but adding filters to the store will narrow it down and make the size of the store smaller. Okay, the Wi-Fi here is not very good. It's taking a long time to respond. We've got some static data here. Okay, so keyboard accessibility is quite important. Everything in EXTJS6 is keyboard accessible, so that's not only the fields, it's things like splitters, so this is usable by the keyboard. The tabs are accessible, the headers, and when we go into the cells, you can see that you're navigating cell by cell. In the ARIA standard, we have navigable mode, which is entered using the F2 key or enter. So when we do that, you can see it drops down into the cell, and from then on, tab is used to navigate into actionable items within the cells. And you can action them by pressing return, and it follows the link. Okay, another thing, which is actually a customer asked me this yesterday, scrolling to a certain position within a grid. With buffered rendering, that's sometimes difficult because the row you might want to scroll to might not actually be rendered. In buffered rendering, we only render a few extra rows either side of the visible area, just enough to allow some scroll and to avoid overloading the DOM. So how do you scroll to row 5000 when it's not there? There's another hurdle there. If you're using buffered rendering, like this is, the record might actually not be there. So this is an asynchronous operation. You first have to load the data, and then you have to ask the grid to scroll to it. So we have a new API, which I'll show you the shape of in a minute. It's called ensure visible. It's a method of grid panel, and you can pass it a record if you have access to the record, and it will scroll there. Or if it's a buffered store and you only know the row number, you can pass it the row number, and it will scroll there. And because this is possibly an asynchronous operation, there's a callback, which it will call when it's arrived at the record. And you can pass it flags. You can ask it to select the record when it's scrolled there. You can ask it to focus on it, and you can ask it to highlight that row. So if we go here, okay, it's a slow API. It's having to get data all the way across the Atlantic. This is a UK-based search. So let's try it again. Yeah. Okay, so if we ask for row 2000, it's an asynchronous operation. It says, I don't have row 2000. It will go and fetch it, and there you saw it highlighted it at the bottom. But if we say now 1, it's got page 1, it'll go straight away. If we go back down, that's not an asynchronous operation. The page is already loaded in the store. You can go there straight away. Okay. Okay, If you have real-time data updating in your grid, if you have rapid updates going to your grid, this can cause some overloading of the browser, and it used to cause overloading of the layout system. We used to lay out the grid every time data changed because it's possible that data could change the shape of the grid. It could change the row heights, which would mean possible change of scroll bar, which could mean things had to change size. In 5 and 6 by default, this doesn't happen. We do not lay out the grid on update. If you have variable height data inside your grid, you can configure that column with variable row height true, and that will tell EXTJS to lay out the grid if the data changes. But it's more granular in EXTJS 5 and 6. Only that column will cause a layout when it changes. If you hide that column, the grid will revert to not laying out when the data changes. So if you're rapidly updating data, you don't have to use a renderer. You can add what's called an updater to your column definition. An updater is actually passed a reference to the TD element which contains the data, and then you can manipulate that in any way you see fit. So you could just change classes on it. You could inject text directly into the cell element, so it doesn't re-render the cell and then do an update of the HTML. You can be more granular than that. If you do need to add a renderer, use only the first argument. I've covered why this is. If you use the record argument, it will update that cell whenever any of the fields change. If you use a renderer and it only produces text, if you say produces HTML false, we'll use a more granular update method. We'll only update the text element inside the cell rather than updating the entire contents of the cell using inner HTML. And that's a slightly faster operation. The most important thing, though, is throttling the updates. If a lot of updates are coming in and they're firing into the grid and the grid's updating immediately, although it doesn't do an EXTJS layout, the browser will do a reflow. And if the multiple updates are arriving every second, the browser will constantly be reflowing. You'll hear the fan turn on and it will overload your system. We have a configuration in Grid now called throttled update. What that does is it queues up updates until animation frame fires. So all the updates which come in before an animation frame are put into a buffer. When the animation frame fires, they're all flushed out in one go. Yeah, this is variable row height. If you specify it true, it will lay out the grid when it's updated. Widget columns are always updated on animation frame, so they're fast by default. So, although you can put components inside grid cells, components are fairly heavyweight life cycles. They take a while to render. Widgets should be used in preference. Widgets are fairly lightly wrapped elements. They're basically configurable elements, so they're much faster to update. So in preference, use a widget where the right type of widget is available. Okay, so here we go to an example. This is one of our examples which uses rapid cell updating. So if we get rid of the distractions. You can see it's updating multiple times a second, and there's very little browser load going on there. It doesn't overload the browser at all. And we're using all the techniques here. We're using cell updaters, we're using renderers, which only use one column, and of course we're using the most important thing, throttled update, so they get buffered and flushed on animation frame. Okay, one thing I forgot to show you, and another thing. With the cell selection model, when you extend the selection, you get an event, and we've got one plugin which provides data calculation on this event. It fills the extended area with numeric data by extending numeric values. It takes the last two numeric values, takes the difference between them, and propagates that difference into the extended area. So if we select this range, we grab the handle there, move it down, you'll see it changes those values. There's a plugin which does this. It only does a simple calculation. It does extension of numerical difference. But if you have any other complex requirements, if you can extend that plugin, react to the same event, do whatever calculations you need, and put them into the area there. Okay, locking grid layouts are slightly more flexible than they were before. Before it was just a basic V-box. There's a grid on the left which was locked, you couldn't scroll left or right, and there's a grid on the right which was scrollable. That's still the default, but you can in fact use a layout config on the top level grid now, on the locking grid, and you can give it a border layout, and the lock grid could be the west region, and the normal grid could be the center. And you can have a splitter there, and you can collapse it, and you can actually control the scrollability of the previously locking grid. You can say scroll X true, and it will scroll side to side. So it's much more than a locking grid now. It's more like a twinned grid layout. And the important thing here that we've enhanced in EXTGS 6 is that navigation crosses the locking boundary, and this is both navigable mode and actionable mode. We can see all these features in action. Okay, we're focused on a cell. We begin navigating using right arrow, it jumps across the boundary, and it's as if there is no boundary there. And if we go into actionable mode, cell editing is now just actionable mode. It just, cell editing just writes focusable editors into the cell, and when you press enter, it enters actionable mode. The focusable component, which is an input field, is detected, it focuses it, and from then on you can navigate between them. And that also jumps the locking boundary. Okay, the keyboard navigation adheres to the ARIA standards: navigable mode, actionable mode, F2 to enter actionable mode, F2 to exit actionable mode. Or if you blur the grid, if you click outside of it, you exit actionable mode, and when you re-enter, you're back in navigable mode. So that's the default. Cells take focus, actionable mode focuses content. Okay, this is the scrolling to record. If it's buffer rendering, the row might not be there. If it's a buffered store, the record might not be there. And so this is what the API looks like. You pass it a record number, you can pass it flags for what to do when it arrives at that record, and there's a callback for it to execute when it arrives at that record. Okay, has anybody got any questions about the new features in the grid? Could you go to the microphone, please, just so we can record it?
In the navigable mode.
In which mode?
Navigable mode. Oh,
Yeah.
sorry, editing mode.
Yeah.
In the editing mode, when we have the cell editor enabled and visible, if I would use right and left keys, it will jump to the cell on the right or on the left. But if I want to navigate within the field,
Yes, the arrow keys go to an input field. They're not intercepted by us. It's a tab. Once you're in actionable mode, it's tab to go between the focusable elements.
yeah. So is there a way of turning this off, or maybe holding the control key could let me navigate within the field? Like if I want to just edit my text inside, instead of positioning the edit cursor with mouse pointer, I would just use right and left to navigate inside the cell, inside the edit box.
Yes, the arrow keys will work as normal. They're not intercepted.
So it won't work as a tab?
No. They'll work as normal inside the input field. Yeah, they'll move the input cursor.
Right. Okay, thank you.
With a spreadsheet selection model, is there any copy-paste functionality in 6? Being able to copy, let's say, a range of cells out into Excel, for example.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the question.
So with the spreadsheet selection model, is there any copy and paste functionality? Being able to copy out the selected range?
Yes, there is. There is, and I can show you that. That's one thing I forgot to do. If we go to here, and we select a range, we press Command C. Yeah, it's
great.
Pasted into a spreadsheet.
Thank you.
I had a question using combo boxes within a grid. In previous versions, we've run into the issue where if you just put one in there, it won't render properly. You actually have to write a custom renderer to get it to display its appropriate value. Has that been fixed?
So you would render a combo box
Within the grid?
using a custom renderer.
Yeah, just adding a editor. Using the editor as a combo box as opposed to like a text field or a number field.
So are you talking about using the cell editing plugin?
Yes.
Yes, that works. Did you have an issue with it?
Yes. What happens is if you put a thing and say it's a 0 and all 1 in Georgia, 2 in California, it would display 0, 1, 2, not all Georgia, California.
So the underlying value...
It would display the ID value, not the actual display value of the combo.
Sounds like a configuration problem in the combo box, describing the two fields, the ID field, the value field, and the display field.
Okay.
But it should work.
Work.
If you want to show me your application afterwards, I'll be in the center zone and I can help you with it.
Okay, great. Thank you.
If I edit a field that's associated to a calculation in a model, is the grid smart enough to block that edit because technically it's not a value, it's a calculation, or would I have to put in some extra code? to keep it from doing that?
To make a field editable, you have to declare it as editable. You have to give it an editor. So as long as you don't add an editor to that column definition, then that won't be editable by default.
Okay.
But if you do add an editor to it, we won't prohibit it. There's nothing which actually blocks that.
If one of the dependent values change, will the value go back to a calculated value from the manual value that I inserted?
Yes, anytime the fields upon which it depends change, the calculated field will change. It will get recalculated.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, anyone else? All right, that wraps it up.